The mystery of heaven is unfathomable, and I, for one, can only bow my head."
Then, with brow yet bent and without changing by the faintest shade his attitude or voice, he added,
"Just hand over that sapphire cross of yours, will you? We're all alone here, and I could pull you to pieces like a straw doll."
Welcome to Meteoread Audiobooks, your best companion, where classic tales are brought to life like never before. Enter the world of the Blue Cross, an unforgettable mystery by G.K. Chesterton, first published in 1910. This tale introduces us to Father Brown, an unassuming priest with an extraordinary knack for solving crimes. When a valuable religious artifact, the Blue Cross, is stolen, Detective Valentin is on the trail. But as he follows a curious set of clues, he realizes that the humble Father Brown may hold the key to outwitting a master thief. Imagine a Netflix show without the visuals, each character distinctively voiced, with bespoke sound design and music capturing the intrigue and charm of Edwardian England. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let the mystery sweep you off your feet. The truth awaits.
Between the silver ribbon of morning and the green glittering ribbon of sea, the boat touched Harwich and let loose a swarm of folk like flies, among whom the man we must follow was by no means conspicuous, nor wished to be. There was nothing notable about him, except a slight contrast between the holiday gaiety of his clothes and the official gravity of his face. His clothes included a slight pale grey jacket, a white waistcoat, and a silver straw hat with a grey-blue ribbon. His lean face was dark by contrast, and ended in a curt black beard that looked Spanish and suggested an Elizabethan ruff. He was smoking a cigarette with the seriousness of an idler. There was nothing about him to indicate the fact that the grey jacket covered a loaded revolver, that the white waistcoat covered a police card, or that the straw hat covered one of the most powerful intellects in Europe. For this was Valentin himself, the head of the Paris police and the most famous investigator of the world, and he was coming from Brussels to London to make the greatest arrest of the century. Flambeau was in England. The police of 3 countries had tracked the great criminal at last from Ghent to Brussels, from Brussels to the Hook of Holland, and it was conjectured that he would take some advantage of the unfamiliarity and confusion of the Eucharistic Congress, then taking place in London. Probably he would travel as some minor clerk or secretary connected with it, but of course, Valentin could not be certain. Nobody could be certain about Flambeau. Years had passed since Flambeau, the infamous criminal, vanished, leaving the world in peace after a turbulent reign of theft and mischief. In his prime, Flambeau was as renowned as the Kaiser, with daily reports of his daring escapes and extraordinary exploits. A towering athletic Gascon, he was known for his humour and strength, often staging wild but non-violent stunts. His true crimes, however, were cunning and grand in scale, like the Tyrolean Dairy Company scam, where he redirected milk cans to serve his clients without a single cow. He was infamous for devising simple yet inventive schemes, painting street numbers to trap a target, inventing portable mailboxes to collect postal orders, and even sending hidden messages via microscopic slides. For the celebrated detective Valentin, hunting Flambeau promised adventure beyond simply locating him. Yet finding the criminal was challenging. Despite his skill in disguise, Flambeau's exceptional height set him apart. Valentin carefully scanned every tall person during his journey, dismissing the unlikely suspects until his eye caught a peculiar group on the train. Among them were 5 shorter individuals and one strikingly inconspicuous figure, a small, bumbling priest carrying brown paper parcels. The priest, awkward and simple, even mentioned he had something made of silver and blue stones in his parcels. Amused by the priest's naive chatter and clumsiness, Valentin let him be, keeping his focus on anyone matching Flambeau's height. After arriving at Liverpool Street and securing assistance at Scotland Yard, Valentin took a thoughtful walk through London. He stopped in a quiet square filled with an unusual tranquility. Here, prosperous but empty-looking houses bordered a deserted patch of shrubbery, and one building caught his eye, a small, inviting restaurant with lemon yellow and white blinds. It stood elevated, with stairs leading up like a fire escape. Valentin, intrigued by its charm and isolation, paused to consider it thoughtfully, sensing it might hold a clue in his search for the elusive Flambeau. Valentin believed that life held surprising moments that defied logic. Clouds forming an eye, trees shaped like question marks, coincidences that felt like miracles. He had recently witnessed such wonders himself, and he knew these unexpected alignments were what gave life its strange charm. Valentin, deeply French in his approach to reason, prided himself on logic but acknowledged its limits. While his successes came from clear, practical thinking, he understood that when no clues or guiding principles existed, pure logic was insufficient. In hunting Flambeau, who could be disguised as anyone in London, Valentin knew standard methods might fail. Therefore he leaned on his own unusual approach. Abandoning the obvious, he searched obscure places and followed paths others might ignore, trusting that intuition and a willingness to embrace the improbable could succeed where reason alone could not. When faced with no clues, Valentin embraced the illogical. Instead of typical places like police stations or rendezvous spots, he systematically visited empty houses, dead ends and useless lanes, reasoning that in the absence of any leads, unconventional paths might reveal what standard logic wouldn't. He believed that anything catching his attention as odd might have similarly caught Flambeau's eye. A quaint restaurant with a quiet elevated entrance struck him as peculiar, so he went inside, ordered a coffee and settled down to think. Lost in memories of Flambeau's clever escapes, from using nail scissors to faking a comet's threat, Valentin felt certain of his mental equality with the criminal despite the disadvantage of being the pursuer.
The criminal is the creative artist, the detective only the critic,
he said with a sour smile and lifted his coffee cup to his lips slowly and put it down very quickly. He had put salt in it. He looked at the vessel from which the silvery powder had come. It was certainly a sugar basin, as unmistakably meant for sugar as a champagne bottle for champagne. He wondered why they should keep salt in it. Yes, there were 2 salt cellars quite full. Perhaps there was some speciality in the condiment in the salt cellars. He tasted it. It was sugar. Then he looked round at the restaurant with a refreshed air of interest to see if there were any other traces of that singular artistic taste which puts the sugar in the salt cellars and the salt in the sugar basin. Except for an odd splash of some dark fluid on one of the white-papered walls, the whole place appeared neat, cheerful and ordinary. He rang the bell for the waiter. When that official hurried up, fuzzy-haired and somewhat blear-eyed at that early hour, the detective, who was not without an appreciation of the simpler forms of humour, asked him to taste the sugar and see if it was up to the high reputation of the hotel. The result was that the waiter yawned suddenly and woke up.
Do you play this delicate joke on your customers every morning? Does changing the salt and sugar never pall on you as a jest?
The waiter, when this irony grew clearer, stammeringly assured him that the establishment had certainly no such intention. It must be a most curious mistake. He picked up the sugar basin and looked at it. He picked up the salt cellar and looked at that, his face growing more and more bewildered. At last he abruptly excused himself, and hurrying away returned in a few seconds with the proprietor. The proprietor also examined the sugar basin and then the salt cellar. The proprietor also looked bewildered. Suddenly the waiter seemed to grow inarticulate with a rush of words.
I think,
said the waiter.
I think it is those 2 clergymen.
What 2 clergymen?
The 2 clergymen that threw soup at the wall.
Threw soup at the wall?
Repeated Valentin, feeling sure this must be some singular Italian metaphor.
Yes, threw it over there on the wall.
And pointed at the dark splash on the white paper. Valentin looked his query at the proprietor, who came to his rescue with fuller reports.
Yes, sir. It's quite true, though I don't suppose it has anything to do with the sugar and salt. 2 clergymen came in and drank soup here very early as soon as the shutters were taken down. They were both very quiet, respectable people. One of them paid the bill and went out. The other, who seemed a slower coach altogether, was some minutes longer getting his things together. But he went at last. Only, the instant before he stepped into the street, he deliberately picked up his cup, which he had only half emptied, and threw the soup slab on the wall. I was in the back room myself, and so was the waiter, so I could only rush out in time to find the wall splashed and the shop empty. It don't do any particular damage, but it was confounded cheek, and I tried to catch the men in the street. They were too far off, though. I only noticed they went around the next corner into Carstairs Street.
The detective was on his feet, hat settled and stick in hand. He had already decided that in the universal darkness of his mind, he could only follow the first odd finger that pointed. and this finger was odd enough. Paying his bill and clashing the glass doors behind him, he was soon swinging round into the other street. It was fortunate that even in such fevered moments his eye was cool and quick. Something in a shopfront went by him like a mere flash, yet he went back to look at it. The shop was a popular greengrocer and fruiterer's, an array of goods set out in the open air and plainly ticketed with their names and prices. In the two most prominent compartments were two heaps of oranges and of nuts, respectively. On the heap of nuts lay a scrap of cardboard on which was written in bold blue chalk, "Best tangerine oranges, 2 a penny." On the oranges was the equally clear and exact description, "Finest Brazil nuts, 4 days, ALB." Monsieur Valentin looked at these two placards and fancied he had met this highly subtle form of humour before, and that somewhat recently. He drew the attention of the red-faced fruiterer, who was looking rather sullenly up and down the street, to this inaccuracy in his advertisements. The fruiterer said nothing, but sharply put each card into its proper place. The detective, leaning elegantly on his walking cane, continued to scrutinise the shop. At last he said,
"Pray excuse my apparent irrelevance, my good sir, but I should like to ask you a question in experimental psychology and the association of ideas."
The red-faced shopman regarded him with an eye of menace, but he continued gaily, swinging his cane.
Why are 2 tickets wrongly placed in a greengrocer's shop like a shovel hat that has come to London for a holiday? Or, in case I do not make myself clear, what is the mystical association which connects the idea of nuts marked as oranges with the idea of 2 clergymen, one tall and the other short?
The eyes of the tradesman stood out of his head like a snail's. He really seemed for an instant likely to fling himself upon the stranger. At last he stammered angrily,
I don't know what you have to do with it, but if you're one of their friends, you can tell them from me that I'll knock their silly heads off, parsons or no parsons, if they upset my apples again."
"Indeed. Did they upset your apples?"
"One of them did. Rolled them all over the street. I'd have caught the fool but for having to pick 'em up."
"Which way did these parsons go?"
"Up that second road on the left-hand side, and then across the square."
"Thanks,"
replied Valentin, and vanished like a fairy. On the other side of the second square he found a policeman and said,
"This is urgent, constable. Have you seen 2 clergymen in shovel hats?"
The policeman began to chuckle heavily.
"I have, sir. And if you ask me, one of them was drunk. He stood in the middle of the road that bewildered that."
"Which way did they go?"
"They took one of them yellow buses over there, them that go to Hampstead."
Valentin produced his official card and said very rapidly,
"Call up 2 of your men to come with me in pursuit."
and crossed the road with such contagious energy that the ponderous policeman was moved to almost agile obedience. In a minute and a half, the French detective was joined on the opposite pavement by an inspector and a man in plain clothes.
Well, sir, and what may...
Valentin pointed suddenly with his cane.
"I'll tell you on the top of that omnibus,"
he said, and was darting and dodging across the tangle of the traffic. When all 3 sank panting on the top seats of the yellow vehicle, the inspector said,
We could go 4 times as quick in a taxi.
"Quite true, if we only had an idea of where we were going."
"Well, where are you going?"
asked the other. Valentin smoked frowningly for a few seconds. Then, removing his cigarette, he said,
"If you know what a man's doing, get in front of him. But if you want to guess what he's doing, keep behind him. Stray when he strays. Stop when he stops. Travel as slowly as he. Then you may see what he saw, and may act as he acted. All we can do is to keep our eyes skinned for a queer thing."
What sort of queer thing do you mean?
"Any sort of queer thing."
answered Valentin, and relapsed into obstinate silence. The yellow omnibus crawled up the northern roads for what seemed like hours on end. The great detective would not explain further, and perhaps his assistants felt a silent and growing doubt of his errand. Perhaps also they felt a silent and growing desire for lunch, for the hours crept long past the normal luncheon hour, and the long roads of the North London suburbs seemed to shoot out into length after length like an infernal telescope. It was one of those journeys on which a man perpetually feels that now at last he must have come to the end of the universe, and then finds he's only come to the beginning of Tufnell Park. London died away in draggled taverns and dreary scrubs, and then was unaccountably born again in blazing high streets and blatant hotels. It was like passing through 13 separate vulgar cities all just touching each other. But though the winter twilight was already threatening the road ahead of them, the Parisian detective still sat silent and watchful, eyeing the frontage of the streets that slid by on either side. By the time they had left Camden Town behind, the policemen were nearly asleep. At least, they gave something like a jump as Valentin leapt erect, struck a hand on each man's shoulder and shouted to the driver to stop. They tumbled down the steps into the road without realizing why they had been dislodged. When they looked round for enlightenment, they found Valentin triumphantly pointing his finger towards a window on the left side of the road. It was a large window, forming part of the long facade of a gilt and palatial public house. It was the part reserved for respectable dining and labelled restaurant. This window, like all the rest along the frontage of the hotel, was of frosted and figured glass. But in the middle of it was a big black smash, like a star in the ice.
Our cue at last.
Cried Valentin, waving his stick.
The place with the broken window.
What window? What cue? What proof is there that this has anything to do with them?
Valentin almost broke his bamboo stick with rage.
Proof. Good God, the man is looking for proof. Why, of course, the chances are 20 to 1 that it has nothing to do with them. But what else can we do? Don't you see we must either follow one wild possibility or else go home to bed?
Hey, you still there? Sorry for jumping in while you're listening. Just wanted to quickly mention that we publish stories like this every Sunday. If you're enjoying it, consider subscribing for more. Happy listening.
He banged his way into the restaurant, followed by his companions, and they were soon seated at a late luncheon at a little table and looked at the star of smashed glass from the inside. Not that it was very informative to them even then.
Got your window broken, I see,
said Valentin to the waiter as he paid the bill.
Yes, sir,
answered the attendant, bending busily over the change, to which Valentin silently added an enormous tip. The waiter straightened himself with mild but unmistakable animation.
Ah, yes, sir. Very odd thing that, sir.
Indeed. Tell us about it.
Well, 2 gents in black came in. 2 of those foreign parsons that are running about. They had a cheap and quiet little lunch, and one of them paid for it and went out. The other was just going out to join him when I looked at my change again and found he'd paid me more than 3 times too much. Here, I says to the chap, who was nearly out of the door, you've paid too much. Oh, he says, very cool, have we? Yes, I says, and picks up the bill to show him. Well, that was a knockout.
What do you mean?
Well, I'd have sworn on 7 Bibles that I'd put 4s on that bill, but now I saw I'd put 14 shillings, as plain as paint.
Well, and then?
The parson at the door, he says all serene. Sorry to confuse your accounts, but it'll pay for the window. What window? I says. The one I'm going to break, he says, and smash that blessed pane with his umbrella.
All 3 inquirers made an exclamation, and the inspector said under his breath,
Are we after escaped lunatics?
I was so knocked silly for a second. I couldn't do anything. The man marched out of the place and joined his friend just round the corner. Then they went so quick up Bullock Street that I couldn't catch them, though I ran round the bars to do it.
Bullock Street,
said the detective, and shot up that thoroughfare as quickly as the strange couple he pursued. Their journey now took them through bare brick ways like tunnels, streets with few lights and even with few windows, streets that seemed built out of the blank backs of everything and everywhere. Dusk was deepening, and it was not easy even for the London policemen to guess in what exact direction they were treading. The inspector, however, was pretty certain that they would eventually strike some part of Hampstead Heath. Abruptly, one bulging gaslit window broke the blue twilight like a bullseye lantern, and Valentin stopped an instant before a little garish sweetstuff shop. After an instant's hesitation, he went in. He stood amid the gaudy colours of the confectionery with entire gravity and bought 13 chocolate cigars with a certain care. He was clearly preparing an opening, but he did not need one. An angular, elderly young woman in the shop had regarded his elegant appearance with a merely automatic inquiry, but when she saw the door behind him, blocked with the blue uniform of the inspector, her eyes seemed to wake up.
Oh, if you've come about that parcel, I've sent it off already.
Parcel?
I mean the parcel the gentleman left, the clergyman gentleman.
For goodness sake, for heaven's sake, tell us what happened exactly.
Well, the clergyman came in about half an hour ago and bought some peppermints and talked a bit, and then went off towards the heath, but a second after, one of them runs back into the shop and says, "Have I left a parcel?" Well, I looked everywhere and couldn't see one, so he says, "Never mind, but if it should turn up, please post it to this address." And he left me the address and a shilling for my trouble. And sure enough, though I thought I'd looked everywhere, I found he'd left a brown paper parcel, so I posted it to the place he said. I can't remember the address now, it was somewhere in Westminster, but as the thing seemed so important, I thought perhaps the police had come about it.
So they have. Is Hampstead Heath near here?
Straight on for 15 minutes, and you'll come right out on the open.
Valentin sprang out of the shop and began to run. The other detectives followed him at a reluctant trot. Valentin and his companion emerged from the narrow, shadowed street into an unexpectedly open sky and vast common, where the evening light still lingered. A luminous dome of peacock green faded into gold over darkened trees, with just enough light to reveal 1 or 2 stars sparkling above Hampstead. Below, a few holidaymakers lingered. Couples sat quietly on benches, and a distant child shrieked from a swing. As the heavens grew more magnificent, Valentin spotted what he had been searching for. Across the valley, silhouetted against the darkening landscape, was a pair of figures, both in clerical attire. One figure was significantly taller than the other, with a slight stoop, but Valentin could tell the man stood over 6 feet. His pulse quickened. The figure beside him was unmistakable. The short, bumbling priest from the Harwich train, his friend with the brown paper parcels. Up to this point, everything seemed to add up logically enough. Valentin had learned that Father Brown from Essex was bringing a valuable silver cross with sapphires to show to foreign priests at a congress. Clearly the silver with blue stones. Flambeau, infamous for uncovering such details, would naturally aim to steal it. That he would manipulate someone as gullible as Father Brown seemed only too easy. So, while Valentin pitied the helpless priest, he almost found Flambeau's choice of such an easy victim disappointing. But as Valentin recalled the strange events leading up to his pursuit, he struggled to see the logic. What did the theft of a sapphire cross have to do with soup thrown on wallpaper, mislabeling nuts as oranges, or paying for broken windows? He had reached the end of his chase but missed the middle. Ahead, the 2 priests Valentin pursued ambled like small black figures on the hill's vast green slope, deep in conversation. The detectives had to resort to crouching and crawling through the high grass and behind trees to remain unseen. Occasionally they could hear only fragments of the conversation, notably the word reason spoken in a light, almost childlike voice. After briefly losing sight of them, the detectives regained the trail which led them to a secluded hilltop. Under an old weathered tree in a commanding yet desolate spot, the 2 priests were seated, absorbed in serious talk as the sunset scenery deepened around them. Valentin signalled his men to silence, crept up behind the tree, and finally, poised in absolute stillness, began to catch the first words exchanged by these peculiar priests. After he had listened for a minute and a half, he was gripped by a devilish doubt. Perhaps he dragged the 2 English policemen to the wastes of a nocturnal heath on an errand no saner than seeking figs on its thistles. For the 2 priests were talking exactly like priests, piously, with learning and leisure, about the most aerial enigmas of theology. The little Essex priest spoke the more simply, with his round face turned to the strengthening stars. The other talked with his head bowed, as if he were not even worthy to look at them. But no more innocently clerical conversation could have been heard in any white Italian cloister or black Spanish cathedral. The first he heard was the tale of one of Father Brown's sentences, which ended,
"What they really meant in the Middle Ages by the heavens being incorruptible."
The taller priest nodded his bowed head and said,
"Ah, yes. These modern infidels appeal to their reason, but who can look at those millions of worlds and not feel that there may well be wonderful universes above us where reason is utterly unreasonable?"
No, reason is always reasonable, even in the last limbo, in the lost borderland of things. I know that people charge the church with lowering reason, but it is just the other way. Alone on earth, the church makes reason really supreme. Alone on earth, the church affirms that God himself is bound by reason.
The other priest raised his austere face to the spangled sky and said,
"Yet who knows if in that infinite universe—"
Only infinite physically, not infinite in the sense of escaping from the laws of truth.
Valentin behind his tree was tearing his fingernails with silent fury. He seemed almost to hear the sniggers of the English detectives whom he had brought so far on a fantastic guess only to listen to the metaphysical gossip of 2 mild old parsons. In his impatience, he lost the equally elaborate answer of the tall cleric, and when he listened again, it was again Father Brown who was speaking.
Reason and justice grip the remotest and the loneliest star. Look at those stars. Don't they look as if they were single diamonds and sapphires? Well, you can imagine any mad botany or geology you please. Think of forests of adamant with leaves of brilliance. Think the moon is a blue moon, a single elephantine sapphire. But don't fancy that all that frantic astronomy would make the smallest difference to the reason and justice of conduct. On plains of opal under cliffs cut out of pearl, you would still find a notice board, "Thou shalt not steal."
Valentin was just in the act of rising from his rigid and crouching attitude and creeping away as softly as might be, felled by the one great folly of his life. But something in the very silence of the tall priest made him stop until the latter spoke. When at last he did speak, he said simply, his head bowed and his hands on his knees,
Well, I think that other worlds may perhaps rise higher than our reason. The mystery of heaven is unfathomable, and I for one can only bow my head.
Then, with brow yet bent and without changing by the faintest shade his attitude or voice, he added,
Just hand over that sapphire cross of yours, will you? We're all alone here, and I could pull you to pieces like a straw doll.
The utterly unaltered voice and attitude added a strange violence to that shocking change of speech. But the guarder of the relic only seemed to turn his head by the smallest section of the compass. He seemed still to have a somewhat foolish face turned to the stars. Perhaps he had not understood, or perhaps he had understood and sat rigid with terror.
Yes,
said the tall priest, in the same low voice and in the same still posture.
Yes, I am Flambeau.
Then, after a pause, he said,
Come, will you give me that cross?
No.
Flambeau suddenly flung off all his pontifical pretensions. The great robber leaned back in his seat and laughed low but long.
No, you won't give it me, you proud prelate. You won't give it me, you little celibate simpleton. Shall I tell you why you won't give it me? Because I've got it already in my own breast pocket.
Are you sure?
Really, you're as good as a 3-act farce. Yes, you turnip. I am quite sure. I had the sense to make a duplicate of the right parcel. And now, my friend, you've got the duplicate and I've got the jewels. An old dodge, Father Brown. A very old dodge.
Yes, I've heard of it before,
said Father Brown, and passed his hand through his hair with the same strange vagueness of manner. The colossus of crime leaned over to the little rustic priest with a sort of sudden interest.
You have heard of it? Where have you heard of it?
Well, I mustn't tell you his name, of course. He was a penitent, you know. He had lived prosperously for about 20 years entirely on duplicate brown paper parcels. And so, you see, when I began to suspect you, I thought of this poor chap's way of doing it at once.
Began to suspect me? Did you really have the gumption to suspect me just because I brought you up to this bare part of the heath?
No. You see, I suspected you when we first met. It's that little bulge up the sleeve where you people have the spiked bracelet.
How in Tartarus did you ever hear of the spiked bracelet?
Oh, one's little flock, you know. When I was a curate in Hartlepool, there were 3 of them with spiked bracelets. So, as I suspected you from the first, don't you see, I made sure that the cross should go safe anyhow. I'm afraid I watched you, you know. So at last I saw you change the parcels. Then, don't you see, I changed them back again. And then I left the right one behind.
Left it behind?
Well, it was like this. I went back to that sweet shop and asked if I'd left a parcel and gave them a particular address if it turned up. Well, I knew I hadn't. But when I went away again, I did. So, instead of running after me with that valuable parcel, they have sent it flying to a friend of mine in Westminster. I learnt that too from a poor fellow in Hartlepool. He used to do it with handbags he stole at railway stations. But he's in a monastery now. Oh, one gets to know, you know. We can't help being priests. People come and tell us these things.
Flambeau tore a brown paper parcel out of his inner pocket and rent it in pieces. There was nothing but paper and sticks of lead inside it. He sprang to his feet with a gigantic gesture and cried,
I don't believe you. I don't believe a bumpkin like you could manage all that. I believe you've still got the stuff on you, and if you don't give it up, why, we're all alone and I'll take it by force.
No, you won't take it by force,
said Father Brown simply, and stood up also.
First, because I really haven't still got it, and second, because we are not alone.
Flambeau stopped in his stride forward.
Behind that tree,
said Father Brown, pointing,
are 2 strong policemen and the greatest detective alive. How did they come here, do you ask? Why, I brought them, of course. How did I do it? Why, I'll tell you if you like. Lord bless you. We have to know 20 such things when we work among the criminal classes. Well, I wasn't sure you were a thief, and it would never do to make a scandal against one of our own clergy. So I just tested you to see if anything would make you show yourself. A man generally makes a small scene if he finds salt in his coffee. If he doesn't, he has some reason for keeping quiet. I changed the salt and sugar, and you kept quiet. A man generally objects if his bill is 3 times too big. If he pays it, he has some motive for passing unnoticed. I altered your bill, and you paid it.
The world seemed waiting for Flambeau to leap like a tiger, but he was held back as by a spell. He was stunned with the utmost curiosity.
Well, as you wouldn't leave any tracks for the police, of course somebody had to. At every place we went to, I took care to do something that would get us talked about for the rest of the day. I didn't do much harm. A splashed wall, spilt apples, a broken window. But I saved the cross, as the cross will always be saved. It is at Westminster by now. I rather wonder you didn't stop it with the donkey's whistle.
With the what?
I'm glad you've never heard of it. It's a foul thing. I'm sure you're too good a man for a whistler. I couldn't have counted it even with the spots myself. I'm not strong enough in the legs.
What on earth are you talking about?
Well, I did think you'd know the spots. Oh, you can't have gone so very wrong yet?
How in blazes do you know all these horrors?
The shadow of a smile crossed the round, simple face of his clerical opponent.
Oh, by being a celibate simpleton, I suppose. Has it never struck you that a man who does next to nothing but hear men's real sins is not likely to be wholly unaware of human evil? But as a matter of fact, another part of my trade too made me sure you weren't a priest.
What?
You attacked reason. It's bad theology.
And even as he turned away to collect his property, the 3 policemen came out from under the twilight trees. Flambeau was an artist and a sportsman. He stepped back and swept Valentin a great bow.
"Do not bow to me, mon ami. Let us both bow to our master,"
said Valentin with silver clearness. And they both stood an instant uncovered while the little Essex priest blinked about for his umbrella.